Let me just start preface to this story as to why I was travelling alone. So one of my best friends, Kayla, and I work seasonally at a hiking lodge in BC for the summer. We're both in our early 20s. She lives and goes to school in New Brunswick. I live and work as a chef in Toronto for the winter. We decided that this year, as I bought a car, instead of flying back home, we would do an epic Canadian coast-to-coast road trip. Everything was going wonderfully. So wonderfully, in fact, that we ended up staying for longer in a few unexpected places and had to cut our East Coast proportion for the trip short. Now, my friend Kayla started her schooling on November the 1st, so I dropped her home in Moncton, New Brunswick on Halloween, and stayed the night at her place, planning to head back to Toronto the following day. After a few glasses of Chandray and some laughs, I decided I couldn't come this close to the East Coast and not see the Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia. So, knowing I still had a week more of vacation before my winter contract, I hastily booked a hostel for the next day. November 1st, I booked from the Cabot Trail. When I booked, only one option came up. I assumed because I waited until last minute to book. A private dorm with a queen-size bed for $35. I thought, what a bargain, and booked it immediately. I left Khalifa's home in Mocktown at 7 AM. It's a long drive. Now, the Cabot Trail is roughly 150 kilometers long, so I thought it to be safe. I'd plugged the hostel address into my Google Maps and headed straight there to get my bearings. I would arrive at the hostel for roughly noon. Knowing it was too early to check in, I figured I'd consult with the front desk and figure out nearby hiking trails and bring my bags later. Now I was about to arrive at my hostel, according to Google, but all around me was nothing but farmland. Google instructed me, the destination's on your left. I saw nothing. About 50 yards ahead up the road, I saw a wire bar bent to look like a letter A. It was spray painted bright red. I was staying at a hostel that started with A, so I guessed it must be the place and followed the dirt road. It led me to what I can only describe as a barn. No signage. There were 2 cars parked in front, so I parked alongside and got out of my car and figured out where I was. Once I got out, a smallish man, around mid-40s with dark hair and intense eyes, popped out of the barn, saying, "Was I the person who booked to stay with them at the last minute?" I said yeah. He wondered why, and I explained my situation. Seemingly satisfied with my answer, he gave me a grand tour of the barn. The first thing that I noticed was that the entirety of the barn had been dug around. It's about 5 feet down and 3 feet around. He led me across some particle board laid down as some sort of ramp. The second thing that I noticed about the property is that there's no windows. This was clearly a barn meant for livestock. The gentleman leading me on this tour was named Kevin, the owner. He proceeded to tell me his grand plans for the place. It all seemed pretty far-stretched. It was just a big old barn with some particle boarding. Most of the rooms had this in them. He led me up the skeleton stairs made out of plywood 2x4s on the cabin loft, where I would be sleeping that night, along with his family, the mother of his 5-year-old son, his son, Kevin's own mother. The upstairs was certainly open concept. A frail curtain separated the beds, with a large open area in the middle. I said if I was his only occupant. He said yeah. I had a feeling he didn't get occupants very often. I then told him that I was interested in hiking in the area and that I wanted to do so before it got dark. He gave me very detailed instructions of his favourite hikes and how to get to them. Off I went. I figured that the place wasn't ideal, and I wished the website would have let me know that's how it actually was. But hey, I booked it last minute. Beggars can't be choosers. Plus he was very friendly and giving me advice on where to hike. I hiked around until it got dark. I didn't pack enough food for the day. I figured I'd head into town for dinner. The nearest town was a clearly booming tourist destination during the summer, but in the off-season, a ghost town. All the hostels and B&Bs in the area were boarded up. It was such a ghost town that even the liquor store was closed during the off-season. Finally, I found a dark, dingy, empty bar to eat dinner. It was, to phrase lightly, a disappointing dinner. I had this romantic image in my head of me sitting on the harbour front, sipping on bubbly, slurping back some ocean fresh oysters. I was assured by the bartender / cook that fried the oysters I'd ordered that it was definitely not fresh. I figured with all my options for the things to do and see exhausted, I should head back to the hostel and read my book. I got back for roughly 8 PM. I could smell the family livestock that lived there and missed cooking dinner. I figured that, with all my options for things to do and see exhausted, I should just head back to the hostel and read my book. I got back for roughly 8 PM. I could smell the family that lived there in the middle of cooking dinner. A little boy ran down the wood steps to greet me. He yelled, "My name is JP, what's yours?" I say, "Oh, nice to meet ya, I'm Alex." He immediately said, "Do I want to play?" I said, "Definitely, just let me put my bags down in my room first." He followed me through the translucent curtains to my room, so insisted of getting settled in. I just headed straight out into the main area. I started throwing a foam ball around with JP. His mother, father, and grandmother are all just sitting down to eat without even acknowledging where we were. The mother and father just seemed to have a basic argument, which turns into yelling. Completely weirded out, I told JP, "I need to go to my room to call my mum, she's wondering where I am." Of course the boy doesn't understand proper boundaries yet and follows me through the curtains to sit on my bed. I try taking his tension away from the family fighting, so I start asking him where he goes to school, his favourite colour. His mother calls for him. He doesn't answer. Instead, he continues to sit there with me, not wanting to cause any problems. I yell to the mother that he's in my room. She runs in and snatches him and yells to the father, "I know what you're like when you get this angry. I'm taking JP. Don't follow us." I hear her book it down the stairs and him run after her. I hear a car start up in the lot, and not just drive but peel out of the driveway. I then hear him start up the excavator. I guess he wanted to let off some steam by working. Now, just left upstairs is me and Grandma. I walk out of my not so private curtained room and say, "Listen, I've gotta go." She starts rubbing my arm and tells me to stay, explaining her daughter-in-law does not understand how Kevin is, and she's a real problem. Now I'm ready to tell her to go away, until I realise she has a knife in her hand from cooking. It's probably a 5-inch paring knife, but with intent. I'm sure it could hurt me. I don't think that she's meant it as a threat. I think she's just old and doesn't understand what she's doing. Maybe not holding the knife so close to strangers though should be obvious. So I go along with what she's saying. She rubs my other arm, with the knife getting closer. I get closer and closer to the door. She keeps rubbing my arm and shoulders with her free hand, telling me stay, and how that her grandson is special, and before I even booked the night, he had a dream that I'd stay with them. As soon as I get out the door, I book it to my car. I start my engine up and get out of there. Kevin in the excavator decides to block the path with about a 5-foot ditch on the other side and the forest behind me. He gets out and says he's sorry and tells me that I have to stay now. Grandma runs out with the knife in hand now, saying that it's Kevin's fault I'm leaving. They argue for 5 minutes, and I say that I'm calling the police. All of a sudden, they get super defensive, like I'm the unreasonable one, so I turn off my engine and start to dial. Kevin gets back in his excavator and starts backing up. As soon as he's far enough away, I see an opening on the grass. I then turn my engine back on and try and get out of there as quickly as possible. As soon as I get out of there, I call my friend Kayla. No service. I remembered back to earlier in the afternoon when I first got to the hostel. I was going to check my messages and saw that there was a no service sign. Even though I wanted to call the cops, I had no way to. Instead, I drove 6 hours straight to Mucktown on New Benswich and stayed with Kayla. This happened about 2 years ago. I'd just moved about an hour and a half away from home. The first time that I lived away, I was working on a kids' activity camp. All the staff lived in 2 massive cabins in the woods. There were about 40 people in each, 2 or 3 per room, so you can imagine how big the cabin was. Anyway, everybody became really close. Some people knew each other from previous years working at this particular camp. None of us really locked our doors because we all knew each other, and everyone hung out in different friends' rooms all the time. On this camp, my job was working with the kids during the day and doing evening shifts on the bar, which was where the staff were, and the teachers and parents had to come down to the children. Now during one night, my roommate and I were both working an evening shift on the bar. She was finishing a couple of hours earlier as she was on a different shift from me. My roommate, Devs, decided that she was just going to go back to the room to read and wait for me to finish so we could catch a movie. She had been out for about 5 minutes when my phone started ringing with her caller ID. I picked up the call, as the bar was pretty dead that night, and the only people in there were staff. When I picked up the phone call, nobody was saying anything on the other end. I put this down to her accidentally dialing me. About a minute later, I get another phone call from a friend that lived across the hallway from us. She told me that I needed to come back to the room now, so I asked the guy I was working with to cover me while I popped back up to the room quickly. I walked down the hallway. There were about 5 people just standing outside of my room. I walk inside. Debs is just standing there crying, which isn't like her at all. Our stuff was all over our room. Please note that this is very weird because I'm sure I have OCD, and often tied it up my side of her room. So she went to tell me her phone had gone missing. I then asked her about phoning me before I come back to the room. She said she had no idea what I was on about. This means somebody had taken her phone and knew who to call immediately. Also, when she left work, There would be no point in stealing her phone, as it's literally worthless. £10 at the very most. A few days later, we started to notice that things had gone missing, but not normal things people would steal. They could have taken laptops, PlayStations, all of that crap. But no, they just took some of our rubbish, as well as some of our clothing. That made me feel ill. For a few days, I kept on getting these phone calls from Debbie's phone. Only silence awaited on the other end of the line. We obviously went and reported it to our bosses, who said that they were going to look into it. We kind of got blamed for leaving our door unlocked. I understand that this was a really stupid thing now. The creepy thing is that a few days later, I walked into our staff lounge and Deb's phone was just placed on the windowsill. Nobody was there, and nobody seemed to be around. Well, at that point, I noped out of there as quick as I possibly could and locked myself in my room until Debs came back. Nothing ever came out of it. We never found out who it was, but I know for certain that they were weird as hell because of the fact that they didn't touch anything worth value, only clothing items and rubbish.
Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in some nature preserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the name. It was pretty primitive camping, no cell service, and we saw 2 other people there the entire time. It was huge, so it was pretty empty. My boyfriend pretty much immediately said these 2 people seemed off to him right away. I don't know if they had anything to do with what happened that night, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman who had left her truck parked off the trail and the hood open. I don't really notice these types of things, but my boyfriend said it seemed to him like she was waiting for someone to pull off beside her and offer to help with her truck. Normally my boyfriend is the type of person to at least offer to call someone, but he said she freaked him out so much he didn't even want to draw attention more than what was necessary. The next person we saw drove by several times while we were setting up. He just kept driving by slowly and looking at us. I didn't even notice though until my boyfriend pointed out that he'd already done it twice. Whether these 2 people had anything sinister going on or not, the real story has to do with what woke us up at around 3 AM. It was incredibly loud and sudden. I couldn't even describe it or compare it to anything, but my boyfriend said it sounded to him similar to a chain gun revving up, or someone using a large tool to scrape gravel. My boyfriend jumped up and looked out the little window of the tent. The sound happened again and again, and it was getting noticeably closer each time. I was about to piss myself, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles off. I didn't question this because loud noises can be heard from miles off, right? Well, later my boyfriend told me that because he didn't want to scare me. It really sounded like it was coming from right down the little dirt road. At one point, he said he suspected it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to get out and dart for the car was because he was afraid it could be someone trying to scare us out of the tent for some dreadful reason. He whispered. I should have noticed he was whispering and knew something was wrong, since otherwise he'd just speak normally, right? Because every little sound I heard outside sounded like someone sneaking up to the tent. Eventually my boyfriend told me to get out and help him pack up. It was maybe 20 minutes after the sound stopped. He held our only weapon, a machete, in front of him. It was a full moon or close to it, so we didn't need light. While we were packing, I noticed an empty beer can close to our dead campfire. It wasn't there when we went to sleep at around 10 PM, and neither of us had brought any beer. Thankfully we got out there, and for the rest of the trip, we either camped in areas that are well populated by other campers, or we got a hotel room. So whatever that was, let's never meet.
I am a small, 21-year-old female from northern Ontario. I live on a fairly large plot of forest, in a small, cabin-sized house with my husband and our 2 kids. My husband works about an hour away. I stay at home with the kids, who are 6 months old and 2 years old. When this incident happened, it was midwinter and very cold and snowy. My husband had been storm stayed at work because the plows had not been able to run the previous day. This isn't really unusual, given the remote area that we live in. Now it's about 6 o'clock, already dark. I was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner while my kids sat on the floor watching TV. There was a knock at the window besides where my kids were sitting. I looked up. Nothing was there. I then walked over to the window with my knife in hand that I'd been washing. I had a really bad feeling about this. The knock definitely sounded like one that is made by a human when they're knocking their knuckles on glass, but I saw nothing and kind of shook it off. Later that night, the knock came again, this time at my kid's window. I had it. I grabbed our shotgun from the locker and stepped out to our porch in pajamas and my husband's boots. I was so angry. I wasn't about to let some idiot mess with my kids. I screamed, "I know you're there, and if you don't go away and leave my kids alone, I'm gonna kill you." There was no answer. Nevertheless, I somehow knew that there was still somebody out there, so I cocked my gun and fired a round into the air, so whoever it was knew I wasn't messing around. Not the smartest or safest thing to do, I know, but what else could I do? Besides, it worked. There was a rustling from outside around my home where a man ran off into the trees. Keep in mind, it's about -30 Celsius. I stood there for about 5 minutes, making sure that he didn't come back. Then I went in and called my husband and the police. Thank God, the police were able to come out despite the weather and looked everywhere around our home and caught the guy wandering through the woods about half a kilometer away. I don't know what happened after they arrested him, but he never come around again.
My friend and I decided to head up to a remote part of the Chattahoochee National Forest to spend our Friday night and Saturday night out camping. I have been camping before, but this was going to be the first time doing it deep in the woods, with basically no human contact within a 5 and 10 mile radius, and no cell service. We set up camp near an old logging path. Once we got settled into camp, we made some dinner, and shortly after getting cleaned up, it was completely dark. And out in the woods, it is the darkest I've ever seen. As the fire started to burn out, we decided to call it a night and head for our tents. At this point, I was already having trouble sleeping. If you've ever experienced the quietness of the woods, you know it's so quiet that it's loud. Every twig snap and rustle in the leaves had me freaking out. I fell asleep finally after about an hour. I woke up late in the night to the sound of a large truck and a dog barking like crazy. My friend's tent was right in front of mine, so immediately hear him whisper to me, "Wake up, now." I can hear the sound of his shotgun pumping as I'm grabbing the machete I have in my tent. The truck is now driving directly next to our camp, and this dog is still going nuts. He stops, gets out, and starts screaming incomprehensible shit. It sort of sounded like somebody yelling at a concert with no music playing. Then he takes a piss on the trees and starts laughing hysterically. After what felt like an hour, this guy gets back in his truck and speeds off. We both think it may have been some guy that comes out here to do drugs or other types of legal stuff, but to me it looked and sounded like someone who was completely mentally insane. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night.
When I was 19, I was a venture scout, sort of like Boy Scouts, only for older kids, and it's gender mixed. I decided to go to this week-long mixed scouting crew camping trip with a friend of mine, but a few days before going, my friends from the venture scouts bailed, so I'd be going up to the mountains alone, with a bunch of strangers. It's not a big deal for me. I handle myself well. When I got there, I was the only venture scout, and the only girl. It's a little awkward, but most of the Boy Scouts were nice, and easy to get along with. Although they weren't used to camping with a girl, they happily accepted me as one of the guys. But there was this one guy, Danny. From the first day of camp, he couldn't take his eyes off me. He'd just stare at me. It was a little uncomfortable, yeah, but I figured he was just socially awkward around girls or something, and tried to pay no mind to him. The next day, while we were hiking, we split into pairs, and guess who I turned out with? Danny. He looked a little too excited at the idea of hiking alone with me. His eyes were wide, crazy looking, but he was small, bad hair, 5'6" or so. I figured that I'd be able to take him on if he even tried to fight me, he was that small. So I didn't raise a fuss about it. Before setting out to the hike, he would keep on asking me if I needed help putting on my sun cream. Even though I kept declining, he kept on pushing the question and trying to put sun cream on in the middle of the daytime until one guy made him cut it out. While we were hiking together, he kept probing me. "How old are you?" "Almost 20, I'd reply. "Don't lie. You must be 14 or something. You're innocent. Young innocent girls are always the cutest." He kept on asking innocent enough questions. Where I lived, if I had siblings, what my favourite colour was. Then he began asking me very weird sexual questions which made me feel very uncomfortable. I was freaking out a little but kept my cool. I couldn't show any distress, any chinks in my armour, as I knew that he'd probably get off on that. The only thing I could do was say, "What the hell?" as I kept my eyes fixated on the path ahead. Then he would constantly compliment my skin. "You don't see a lot of girls with pale skin. Do you use moisturiser? Your skin's really pale," he'd ask, attempting to touch my hand, but I kept my arm close to me, held fast to my backpack. I was incredibly tense. Every muscle in my body was screaming now. I sorely regretted wearing a tank top, as I could feel his eyes on me. He started telling me how pale beautiful skin is and how it was so white, since you can see the rope burns and the bruises better. That would send chills down my spine and made me anxious to my stomach. He said then about how he fantasized about sexually assaulting people. I was in disbelief. I kept on gazing at the path ahead. He was constantly smiling, doing a creepy childish kind of smile that really upset me. I just kept silent and quickened my pace. He felt way too close, far too close. I wanted to run. He could probably see the fear in me at this point. There was no hiding it. But then, I saw another pair of scouts that were up ahead. I ran to them, telling them that the four of us should be a group. They declined at first, saying that we're supposed to be going in twos, but upon seeing how distressed I was, they changed their mind, looking confusedly at Danny, who silently was glaring at them. I was just glad that somebody else was there other than Danny. The four of us went up the mountain. I tried to keep close to the other guys as much as possible and as far from Danny. Upon reaching the end of the trail and regrouping with the others, the two Boy Scouts offered to switch up partners to descend the mountain. Danny looked downright upset, angry even. He was looking at me as though I'd betrayed him, but I didn't care. I accepted the offer and was able to get back to the camp in relative peace and normality. On the way down, the Boy Scout I was with asked me if Danny was bothering me or something. I lied though. I said he wasn't bothering me too much, After all, I was 19. I thought it would be pathetic to get stressed out about a 15-year-old kid. I figured that as long as I was with the other boys, I'd be fine. But then, that night, I was alone in my tent. Everybody else got to sleep in pairs of 2 or 3, but I was the only girl. I had to be alone in my tent. It's always a little creepy being alone and isolated in the forest, away from everyone. The scoutmasters insisted my tent be far away from the boys. I was in a vulnerable, isolated position as a result. I was panicking and was slowly drifting off to sleep, but late at night, I heard rustling outside. I figured it was just a deer or elk. It's usually just that. I told myself not to worry and went back to sleep. But then I heard the tent opening. Opening my eyes, I peeked through the crack in my sleeping bag to see what it was. And there I saw the white of an eye looking back at me. While looking through the small opening of my tent, I saw Danny staring at me. I froze, held my breath. I held my dad's hunting knife close to me, hiding in my sleeping bag, not moving a muscle, staring Danny down, pretending to be asleep, ready to fight at any moment. Should he take one step into my tent, I'd be ready. But he never did anything. He just stared at me, watching, breathing heavily and muttering incoherently to himself. "You there?" I thought I could hear him say. Eventually, after what seemed to be an hour, he left. The next morning, exhausted, I caught naps when I could and if I could, and kept close to the other scouts. It was difficult to maintain my calm and cool composure. The scout leaders were frustrated with me since I wasn't paying much attention to their instructions. I didn't care now. I was always on some level of alert, as Danny would creep up on me and try and caress my neck or play with my hair. Every night, Danny was there, watching. One night, he went digging through my backpack looking for something. Unfortunately for him, I kept all my clothes and personals tucked away with me. In the end, he left with nothing. I grew up in a rough situation and some bad circumstances, so I always felt that I could really rely on myself. Asking for help was never an option. Asking for help meant you were weak, so it hardly ever occurred to me. I was prepared to tough out the rest of the week, but a little over halfway through the week, Danny was called away by the scouts and sent home. I got the feeling that the Boy Scout that helped me before saw what he was doing and complained to the staff, as while everyone was confused and happily saying bye, he just crossed his arms firmly and stared as Danny left. Danny looked so bewildered and confused, like he didn't understand why. It was so strange. I tried my best to forget about it, and the rest of the week went off without a hitch, but the more I think back on it, the more I realise how damn weird and bizarre that kid was. I fear that he may have ended up being a sexual predator or something like that. All I know for certain is that he was very, very disturbed, and that I'm lucky that him targeting me didn't go on any longer. This happened over a decade ago, somewhere in northern Michigan during the summer. My friend Kathy, 18, and my boyfriend's half-sister, Meh, 16, and I, 17, drove down from our hometown to visit friends. And we're on our way back home in Kathy's little Geo. It had lots of engine problems, like overheating, ignition problems, and was constantly falling apart. More than once, it had stalled or just stopped working in the middle of the street while trying to get somewhere. But Kathy thought we'd have to finish since we'd already started. It's a little past midnight and we're roughly an hour away from home. There's nobody on the road, dense woods on every side, no streetlights, no moon. I can barely see past the windscreen because I have a form of albinism, which means that I'm legally blind in my left eye and have really awful vision in my right. My depth perception is terrible. I can't see more than a few feet ahead of me at most, but I usually can make out lights of other cars passing. Sometimes I can make out street lights. Now we drove down this narrow, hilly road. On the descent down the hill, the Geo makes a strange sound. Kathy starts braking, and we get to the bottom of the hill. The car quits working. Kathy swears and turns on the hazards. She and I get out of the vehicle, and I help pop the hood, which causes a bunch of smoke to fly out. After the smoke clears, she tries to figure out what went wrong. We stood in the dark for at least 45 minutes, maybe more, before we realised that we couldn't fix the car and needed a tow truck. These were the days of printouts and brick phones, so we couldn't whip out our smartphone to call the closest tow truck. I decided to call my boyfriend, Caleb, to come and pick us up. We said to bring a tow truck and pick up the Geo when it's daylight. Kathy agreed, so I took out my Nokia and called my boyfriend. I then realised that there's no service. I then asked Kathy and Mare if either of them had service. They both check their phones and shake their heads. Mare's getting a bit panicky, and we each held up our phones trying to get a signal to no avail. It's really hot, and after failing to get any kind of service, we're all feeling a bit spooked and uncomfortable. Mare begins to do something because she's afraid. Kathy attempts to calm her down, and I wonder if I go through the woods and hills, maybe I can get some reception. I tell them that they have to wait by the car, and I walk away from them up the hill. I get up there, no signal. I walk further and further away until I reach the top of the hill. I can't see either of them anymore. Even at the top of the hill, I don't get a signal. I know there's gotta be trees in the way, so I decided to climb up the tree just to see if it would work. In hindsight, this was not my brightest idea, but with me being an idiot, I went towards a tree and began to climb up. At this point, I just wanted to go home. This is the only thing on my mind. I find a nice one with low branches and decide to climb up this. I climb the branches higher and higher, and I'm about midway up the tree. I feel my pack of cigarettes fall out of my shorts pocket. I'm kind of annoyed, but I figure I can just look for it when I climb back down. I take my phone out and hold it up. I had service. Relieved, I called out Caleb, but he doesn't answer, so I try again until he does. He answers in a sleepy and annoyed voice, but I'm having none of that and simply explaining our situation. He says, "Where are we?" and I give the name of my road and my best guess as to how far along we carry on here. He says that he'll be on his way and tells me to go back and wait for Meh and Kathy, then yells at me for being so stupid to climb up a tree in the dark with my bad depth perception. I said I'm gonna be fine, and we hang up. I start climbing down the tree, but my hand touches a big glob of sap, so I stop and try and wipe it off my shirt. I'm already sweaty and gross, so I'm not too happy about the sap. I'm now failing to get this sap off my hands, and I hear the strangest sound below me. I completely freeze, not being able to place what the hell the sound is. I hear it's moving pretty fast. I stare down into complete darkness below, but I can't see anything. Just hear this noise continuing. It comes closer and closer, and then I hear it right below my tree. Then it stops, right under my tree. I hold on to the branches as tight as I can and wait. I hear leaves shuffling and twigs snapping. After a while, it stops, and the weird noises start again, but it's heading away from me, deeper into the woods. I wait until I can no longer hear the sound, then finish climbing down and jump out of the tree. It's completely silent now because the sounds of the woods. So I grope around on this ground to find my cigarettes. I don't find them. So I make my way out of the woods and back towards the road. I jog to the hill. When I reach the bottom, I notice Meh and Kathy are no longer standing by the car with the hazards on. I walk over to the car, and Meh rolls down the window a little bit and says in a panicked voice, "Elizabeth, where the hell were you?" I then look over my shoulder and point towards the hill and start to explain that I can hear something. But Kathy yelled, "What the hell were you doing? Get back in the car." I give them a weird look, but Meh unlocks the door and I crawl towards the back seat, slamming it behind me. Kathy slams the locks and double checks them while Meh rolls up the window, making sure the rest are rolled up. One of the windows is never closed all the way, but there's always less than a finger's space, so it's not a big deal. But Meh is freaking out, and Kathy has lost her cool as well. I am still confused and ask what the hell is going on. Meh tells me that a bit after I went up the hill, some weird person come out of the woods, and that he ran really funny up the hill in the direction that I went. That got me freaked out, and they said that they turned off the lights. They thought that he had got me. I am honestly scared at this point, because if I hadn't have stopped to wipe the sap off my hands, I would likely have gotten off just in time to encounter the man. I just knew it as the same person. I tell them the story. Everybody in the car is terrified, but relieved that Khalib is on his way. We only have to play the waiting game now. We all sit in the car for what feels like forever. The sense of dread does not leave us. Kathy and Meh are looking out the windows, surveying the area. I'm just sitting there hoping that Khalib will hurry up and come and rescue us. Suddenly, I hear somebody whine, "Oh my god," and then crying. Kathy snaps her head to where Meh is looking and gasps. I look to where they're facing. I see nothing. But then, I hear through a small opening in the windows that same weird swish sound from earlier. Meh ducks down, as though doing so will make her invisible, and Kathy hides her head behind the steering wheel. I follow lead and hunch down in my seat, but the noise comes straight up to the window. I can almost make out the silhouette of a tall, skinny man, and then he presses his face up against Meh's window. I finally see him. Nobody screams. You'd think that we would, but it didn't happen. We all just stare at each other. He looks in at us for a while until Kathy switches her brights on, hoping that he's gonna run away. It did nothing. The dude literally just walked in front of the car and stood in front of the headlights. Maybe he thought that he could block us from leaving? I don't know. I couldn't make out his features very well, but the guy had to have been on something, and he was somewhere over 6 feet tall, no older than 30. He had the face of an average Joe, nothing special, nothing really sinister, or particularly scary. Now, he had dark shaved hair, a weird expression on his face, pale skin and long face. Meh said that he had light coloured eyes and stubble with eyebrows that made him look like he was always concerned. There was no way I could make that out though, I have to take her word for it. What's really weird is that it's like 80 degrees and this guy is wearing corduroys and an oversized sweater with abnormally long sleeves. The sleeves went over his hands and would flop back and forth, just in front of the geo. I'm not sure how long he was in front of the car for, but then he does something really bizarre. He bends his arms up towards his face, which I can only describe as looking like a praying mantis, because of the way his sleeves were hanging. He begins making circles around the car in a weird rhythm, taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back like Willy Wonka, but at no speed or anything. This is where I noticed the swish sound, exactly like what I'd heard up the trees. He was doing the 2 steps forward and 1 back in the woods. He was going after me, but he couldn't do it normally. There was definitely something wrong with him. By now, Meh was sobbing and Kathy seemed like she had to vomit, so I felt like I had to be the brave one. I looked at the slight space in the open window, and when he orbited his way over there, I said, "Hey, stop it, you're freaking us out." He heard me. He halted, looked back over at the car, straight at me. I said very firmly, "Leave," and he took an extended pause, smiled, and Willy Wonkaed his way out of vision into the darkness. After a while, Kathy said he disappeared into the woods, and Meh was like, "I can't believe this worked." We awkwardly laughed about what a weirdo he was, and he left and whatever, and we went to go back to waiting for Caleb, somewhat reassured, still paranoid. But then, after some time, Kathy said, "Oh, he's back." I couldn't see, but apparently, he was doing the 2 steps forward, 1 step back parallel to us on the other side of the road. And this time, he had a big branch in his hand. Meh got scared again. I held her hand so she'd feel better about it, even though I was ready to crap myself. It was awful, because I didn't know if he was coming towards us or moving away, or what the hell he was up to. It was kind of like when you know there's going to be a jump scare in a horror movie. I heard the swishy sound back towards the geo, on my window. He smacks it with a tree branch. Meh and I panic. I scoot as close to her as possible. They see the dude back up into the woods, then come running back and slamming the branch back into my window. It's like he's jousting with no horse. Thankfully, the window didn't break, but we just kept on getting the swishing sound followed by a clonk, which he did in a repetitive manner. Kathy perks up in her seat and starts pointing at the road ahead. I see headlights. She blares a horn and flashes the lights. Lo and behold, it's our saviour, Caleb. He brought his older brother, Alex. They both get out of his car and head over to us. Now Caleb and Alex are both tall guys. Walking around with them was like walking around with high elves. I felt very safe. Caleb is 6'8", Alex is 6'5". So I thought 2 taller dudes would scare him, but nope. Caleb walks towards him, trying to assess the situation. Alex comes over to the car and taps on the window, tells Kathy to get out. She does, and he walks her over to his car. Then he comes back to put the car in neutral so he can push it off the side of the road. Meh and I slowly get out. Meh makes a bolt for her brother's car. I help Alex push the car to the side of the road while Khalib tries to distract the guy, holding the end of his stick, telling him to go away. The guy yanks a branch away from Khalib, starts backing up by going 2 steps backwards and 1 forward. He eventually disappears down the street. I can't see him, Khalib can. The dude backs up pretty far and then laughs at Khalib, who sprints the other way down the road because the stick could have really hurt him. He then bumps past Alex, who had already got out of the Geo and was opening his car door, leaving me behind and the Geo alone. The guy apparently changed directions and aimed the stick at me. I really couldn't tell. I just heard everybody shout, "Elizabeth." This startles me. I jump to the side of the Geo, hearing this guy smashing his stick into the back window and a loud thud, then the swish sound. I take the long way round the car, sprinting off into the road, and feel Khalib grab my arm and tug me over to Alex's car. I feel as though all the wind and life has been knocked out of me. Khalib manages to shove me into the back seat and scrambles into the passenger side. By now, we are all safely in the car, and the weird guy is standing in his mantis position in front of the headlights again. He's abandoned the stick and just stood there with no intention to move. Alex puts the car into reverse and slams on gas, making me knock my head against the door. Then makes the sloppiest U-turn ever and nearly drives us into the woods, but gets us back to the road. Everybody was in what the hell mode as Alex tore away, far over whatever the limit is. Matt and Kathy saw the weird guy chasing behind us, just before Alex made the U-turn. The next day, I went back there with Khalib, Kathy, and the dude from the tow truck place. There was no sign of him. As we approached the Geo, we saw that, in the space where the window was, there were all my cigarettes. The box was missing, but they were neatly jammed in a row along the window space. I have no doubt it was courtesy of this weird guy. To this day, I wonder if he knew I was up in the tree and took them, or if he thought that I dropped them further into the woods and was looking for me, or if he found them and decided to put them there because he was so weird. I still wonder what his intentions were. I have so many unanswered questions. During my early 20s, I worked as a meter reader in Iowa City, Iowa. A meter reader is a person who records how much electricity, gas, or water that you've used during each month. If your meters are on the inside and you want an accurate bill, a meter reader must enter your home whether you're there to let them in or not. Entering a home when the owner isn't present is something that I never got used to, no matter how loudly I knocked, how obvious I made it. I never shook that uneasy feeling that I was not welcome. A home's exterior is just the projection of ourselves to the world, but the further that you venture inside, the closer you come to seeing truly what kind of person lives there. And if you want the raw, unfiltered truth, head to the basement. I hate basements. I've seen walls that looked like giant, static-filled TV screens. I've seen roaches scurrying around a white background, cobwebs so thick and dusty that it looks as though there's been an explosion at a cotton candy machine factory filled with spiders. I've seen rats, snakes, weapons, neglected children, abused pets, squatters, massive hordes, bizarre items, meth labs. Heck, I even saw a coffin once. There's rational explanations to all of these things. Well, not all of them. But there was one basement where what I found was beyond the grasp of logic. That's what made it so terrifying. It was an old apartment home. Now from the outside, it looked like every other home on the block. I entered the back door and found myself to the top of a staircase. I ran my hand along the wall until I grazed the light switch. I flipped the switch, but no lights come on. I wasn't carrying a flashlight. A typical routine involved 5 or 6 hours of walking alone. I carried as little as possible. Oftentimes, I used the light from my handheld screen, but it only illuminated whatever was about a foot in front. So armed with the world's worst lantern, I stepped into the darkness. Once I made it to the bottom, I blindly shuffled across the room, one baby step at a time. With arms outstretched and head down, I eventually reached the other side of the basement. I shined the dim light from my handheld along the wall. I discovered that there were 2 doors. Each door led into its own smaller room. I chose the door on the right and found the meters in the far corner. As I entered, I started reading. I began to hear noises coming from the other room. Something was moving. There was whimpering that grew louder and louder the longer that I listened and stayed there. I eventually realized that it was a dog. It sounded weak, distressed. I tried to open the door. It's locked. At this point, the dog was scratching the other side of the door too. I felt helpless. I reported it when I got back to the office, but I could not shake the thought of the dog. It stuck with me for over a month, until the next return. So there I was, 1 month later, back within the basement that I kind of dreaded now. At least this time I knew where the meters were. I shuffled back into the little room on the right when I kept my ears open for any sounds coming from the other room. This time though, I didn't hear anything. I read the meters and started making my way back, but I could not shake the memory of that dog. Was it still trapped inside the room? My curiosity got the best of me. I stood outside the door for a few moments, listening. Nothing. That's when I made a huge mistake. I tried to open the door. I had no more than jiggled the door a little bit and then I heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling screams. Unlike anything that I've ever heard in my life. Sounds that I don't think a human was capable of producing. Short, piercing, high-pitched shrieks followed abruptly by a low, drawn-out, guttering moaning sound that ultimately morphed into something that I can only describe as crying, but much, much louder. It was all over the place, truly psychotic in nature, harrowing to say the very least. I stumbled backwards. I nearly lost my balance. I shouted something like, "Hello? Who's there?" There was nothing. Just the screams. "Are you okay? You need help?" Still, no response, only screams. Now there was no doubt that I yelled loud enough for him to hear me. He didn't want my help. He wanted me gone. I fumbled my way through the darkened room towards the exit. I reach the top of the stairs. I just stand there, listening. I was trying to wrap my mind around what I was hearing. I waited for the screaming to stop, but it never did. When I finally left, it was still just as loud, and just as terrifying as it sounded in the first place. I felt relieved, but that quickly vanished when I realized that I had to do it all over again the next month. I reported what I had heard, but nothing come of it. As my return drew nearer, a sense of dread grew inside me. What kind of lunatic sits alone in total darkness and silence? My mind created endless explanations for what kind of hell laid beyond that door. By the time I returned, I'd built him up so much in my mind that it could only be the devil himself down there. Anything else would be a letdown. There was no sign of him for the next month, even several months. I'd nearly given up on solving the mystery when a stroke of luck pulled me back in. One night, I went to see a concert with my friend Laura. After the show, I gave her a ride home. She moved somewhat recently. She had to give me directions. I didn't pay that much attention to where she was leading until she pointed out a home ways up in the street. I couldn't believe it. She just moved into the mystery home with that weird room in the basement. This sounds weird, but have you ever noticed anything odd about the basement at this? Before I could finish, she said, "A crazy guy lives down there." Finally, I had confirmation. She went on to tell me that, even though her apartment was in the attic, she often heard him yelling late at night. But that wasn't all. She actually met him. One day, while walking to her car, she said she saw him standing in the lawn. He stood perfectly still, with no expression on his face. He was directly in her path, so she cautiously made her way around him. She noticed he was staring at her, so she had offered a friendly hi. To this, he had no reaction, except for one unsettling exception. He stuck out his tongue, then quickly sucked it in his mouth and resumed acting like a statue. Thoroughly creeped out, she got in her car and drove away. 2 or 3 months later, she finally met himself. I entered the back door like I had so many times before. This time, something was different. There was a light on in the basement. I peered down the staircase. At the bottom, a ragged-looking dog was staring back at me. It was the same dog that I'd heard during my first visit. Then, I realized something else. Behind the dog, I can see some bare feet. The ceiling blocked my view for the rest of whoever was standing there. It didn't matter. I knew it's him. I should have right then, but I didn't. I know this probably doesn't make sense, but at this point, my desire to finally get some answers outweighed my fear. I shakily called out, "Meter reader," and started to make my descent. As I made my way down, more of him was revealed. He looked to be middle-aged. His head was shaved. His eyes were wild. He was wearing pants but with no shirt. What I remembered the most was just how lean and weird his body looked. He had the look of a body that was never at rest. I explained who I was and what I was doing there. To my surprise, not only did he talk, but he actually sounded somewhat normal. The volume and pitch of his voice was odd, but he said the same sort of things that people typically said to me to readers. I even started to doubt whether or not this was the same man that I heard screaming, but his behaviour slowly removed all doubt that I had. As I read the meters, he rapidly paced back and forth. He was constantly wiggling his hands together and sporadically cocking his head from side to side. The longer he spoke, the more agitated he became. He started these really weird verbal tics. Every so often, he'd blurt out a really loud sound in the middle of a sentence. He was trying to suppress these, but he was losing the battle. As I started to make my way towards the exit, he followed. His verbal outbursts grew louder and louder and more frequent. I was petrified. When I reached the stairs, I drew our conversation to an end and said goodbye. As I turned my head to the staircase, he could no longer hold it in. Screams. The very same unforgettable screams that I'd heard coming from a few months back. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, flung the door open and rushed into the daylight. A month or two later, I had a couple of friends over to my place. I was excited to tell her about my encounter, but as I was relaying what happened, I could tell that something was on her mind. When I finished telling the story, she told me about something that she had seen a couple of weeks earlier. One day, she noticed lights flashing outside her window. She looked outside just in time to see the police officers placing the man from the basement into the back seat of a cop car. She later found out from another tenant that he had brutally attacked somebody with a weapon. That was the last that she ever saw of him. I don't know what come of the man in the basement. I like to think that he got the help that he so desperately needed. So this story takes place over one summer when I was 14 years old. It was around 11 PM. I was on my bedroom computer. I'd just gotten home. I was living with my brother at the time because my parents were in Florida for a while, so me and my brother were the only ones home, and the only ones who had access to the home. I needed a photo of myself or something. I don't remember what for, but I opened my camera roll. Immediately, my whole body froze. I couldn't move. I immediately closed the camera roll and sat in my bed for a while. I began shaking. Tears of fright come over my eyes. I gained the courage to open the camera roll to look again. I stared at the photo for at least 10 minutes, feeling more uneasy with every second that passed. I checked the time of the picture, and that made me even more distressed. The picture was taken at 9:45 PM. What made it worse was that me and my brother were both gone by 8 to get dinner. No one was home alone to take the picture. Afraid to leave my room, I picked up my phone and messaged my brother. I told him that I was so scared I couldn't move, and if he would come here. He said to me, "What's wrong?" and I sent him the picture from my computer along with what happened. Him, thinking it was a joke, laughed and told me good night. Me not joking, I called him. He could obviously hear me crying and started questioning me. I told him to come to my room. He did so. He entered my room with a golf club for protection. At this point, we're both terrified, staring at a blurry picture of a man we did not recognize. We decided to go check out the home to see if anyone was there. So we proceeded to swipe through all 4 floors of the home. We didn't see anything sketchy on the top 3 floors. We walked down to the basement. We walked down, and my brother leaded the way. "Crap," he whispered. I looked to the back corner of our basement where the cellar door that leads to the outside is. The door and the hatch that covered the steps were both open. After this happened, we called the police and showed them the picture and told them the story. They told us to lock our doors and call them if we heard or saw anything. Great, we thought. We locked the doors and both sat in the room for the rest of the night. Whoever was in our home and on my computer must have opened my computer and opened the camera accidentally. He must have accidentally pressed the spacebar while the camera was open in the background and got a picture of him. I still wonder why somebody would have just broken into the house for no reason. Nothing was stolen, no drawers or cabinets were touched. Nothing seemed to be out of place. My brother ended up moving out of the home for a few days after, in fear that the guy would come back. Not too far from where I live, there are a series of roads called Kirby. I call them hell. My friends and I caught wind of the legends and stories that come from Kirby Road, and decided that we just had to explore them. Being young and stupid, we spent a lot of weekends driving around these roads, always on the search for the next thrill. At times, we'd find something we couldn't face in the dark, and we would go back to explore it during the daytime, but we'd never stumble upon the same place twice, although it was not for a lack of trying. In fact, this story is only because of our determination to see the same part of hell twice. Our trip began with 3, myself, my best friend, and one that we'll just call Chris. We headed towards hell with the hopes of stumbling across a place we had found before, an abandoned and tagged with warning signs barn with nooses tied across whatever rafters remained. But as I stated before, you'll never go to the same part twice. After an hour of driving, we noticed a barn located down a hidden drive surrounded by a cornstalk. It didn't take long to realize that this was not the place. Normally, we would have left, but we didn't. I noticed a pile of body shapes in the barn. If you've seen Japanese creepers, you know what I'm talking about. Sack-like material wrapped over a body, tied at the neck, against the waist, and finally around the ankles. Now imagine a pile of 50 or more. Despite our chances of becoming an addition, we ventured inside. I'm happy to admit that we were wrong with our assumption of a pile of dead bodies. However, discovering what was wrapped up was unnerving. Jesus and Mary everywhere. The pile was just beginning. On the second level, there were Jesus's and Mary parts. The heads felt as though they were watching you. Despite the Jesus pieces, Chris was hell-bent on making it into the old ladder that sat in the furthest part of the barn, and we did our best until my best friend tripped on a latch hidden beneath the hay. A quick kick revealed the door. Within minutes, her and Chris went down while I kept a watch. Hidden under this door was a small ladder that led you to a stable-like compartment. I'd say they were about half the size of a normal keep for a horse, but what would normally be opened for a horse to keep its head out was covered by bars. Each stable had a lock. They were filling me in as they went in, not knowing much about barns or horse keep. All seemed normal until I asked where the doors were, down towards the exit and entrance of this. There wasn't one. Obviously, this was a cellar full of horse stables which were useless for horses. We had enough. The wrapped up statues were creepy, but the stables, that did it for us. They then practically flew up the stairs and we headed out quick. I was a bit more weary going out than in, keeping my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping on whatever was hidden under the hay. What I saw beneath my foot stopped me instantly. There were pictures. Everywhere. Anywhere the hay was disturbed, there was another picture to be seen. Every single picture that I glanced at was of a lone woman. Every single picture was different, a different female. Picture after picture of individual women, none of which were smiling for the camera. Of course, I didn't stay to confirm. I grabbed one picture and ran off. We never went back. I never found out what was actually going on there. To be honest, I don't want to know. When I was about 15, I got really sick with bronchitis for about 2 weeks. One snowy morning during that time period, I was home alone with my younger brother. I was laying on the living room couch with him, sitting on the floor next to me, watching TV. We started to hear some strange sounds from the basement, but I shrugged it off, figuring that it's probably just a furnace or pipes. The home was from the 1800s, but the sounds grew louder and louder. I was beginning to get sufficiently creeped out. I wasn't trying to say anything to my brother because I didn't want to alarm him. Now I should probably explain my setup a little here. There was a hallway off the living room that contained the bathroom and basement door. From there, we're sitting in the living room. I could see the basement door clearly, and in the basement, there was a door that led to the backyard, but it was a pretty difficult place to get to. So I was sitting and watching the door because I was purely paranoid at this point. All of a sudden, I heard and saw the doorknob move ever so slightly. I jumped up and told my brother to grab the landline so I could call our mum. She told us to put a chair in front of the basement door and call the police immediately. I did just that, and they were on their way. The doorknob moved a few more times, as well as some strange tapping sounds and knocking. It's pretty safe to say that we were terrified. Now we sat there quietly and watched the door the entire time. When the cops arrived, we discovered there were big footprints in the snow going towards our driveway and back out to the backyard. They looked around but they didn't find anything. Even to this day, I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. When I was about 13, this nice family moved out of their home in Prescott Country Club, Dewey, Arizona, just down from the block from my family. A strange guy moved in. The condition of the property rapidly deteriorated. The day he moved in, He had a large U-Haul type truck. This was fine, but it never left. The truck remained there, parked in the driveway. It also had an extension cord running from the home to the truck. I thought this was weird. Eventually, there were paint cans all over the yard, random junk on one side of the home, a real mess. This was not welcome in the small community, but anybody who talked to the guy said he come across as really weird, and he warned them to tread lightly. I mowed lawns and was hired to do our friend's lawn while they were on an extended vacation. They lived next to the weird guy. Every day when I was sweating myself in the morning, I could see this weirdo spying on me through the blinds in his living room. He wasn't very good at hiding. Now fast forward 2 years, and my family is watching the 5 PM news while eating dinner, and they start reporting on a developing case where a woman's frozen body was found inside a freezer inside a truck. They showed the home and we all went silent. I ran outside and looked down the street. Sure enough, every news agency in the state had a truck parked in the street, satellite dish extended, cops had everything cordoned off. The guy abducted a woman, murdered her and did other terrible things before, stored her body in a freezer, which eventually went into the truck and was driven to AZ.